Welcome, everyone, to Episode 6 of our non-Bible study informative class on the Gospel of Matthew. This is not your typical Bible study. This is a cultural and historical and linguistic teaching developing a backdrop of information that will help clarify and enhance the teachings of Jesus Christ as recorded in the book of Matthew. The emphasis of this class is not on just what Jesus taught, but why he taught what he taught. So we're going to look into that. For today's class, we journey back to the Sermon on the Mount. Hi, everybody. I really appreciate you joining me on Thursday nights, and I hope you're doing well. I hope that you are remaining hopeful and full of faith and trusting in God and experiencing rest like never before. And I hope that you're finding these teachings helpful for you. And if you are finding these classes helpful in any way, please let me know. You could comment below, you could message me, you could text me, you can email me. And if you do not find these classes of any help to you, then please feel no obligation to comment or message me in any way. And now back to our regularly scheduled program. Previously in the book of Matthew, we were looking at chapters 5, 6, and 7, which is known as the Sermon on the Mount, as called by Matthew. So we noticed that the Sermon on the Mount is a collection of teachings from Jesus, and not just one sermon. There were many teachings that happened in many different places. 3 chapters of key teachings from Jesus we're seeing here in Matthew. In other words, the Sermon on the Mount was not just one sermon given by Jesus in one place at one time. You can call it a collection of greatest hits, if you will, as recorded by Matthew, of Jesus' teachings. You have a whole slew of teachings, just as such as what we started with last week, the Beatitudes. And that was a very informative class last week. If you missed that teaching or any of the teachings, you can find all of our Matthew classes on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and punch in 2 words, Powerhouse San Pedro, Powerhouse San Pedro, and you will find all of our teachings on Matthew as well as our Sunday messages. So as we begin, I before we move further into Matthew, there is a common misunderstanding that I want to clear up among readers of the Word. And that is that Jesus came to do away or abolish the law or to do away with the Old Testament. Like in with the new, out with the old. That cannot be further from the truth. In actuality, Jesus is protecting the law from being broken. And tonight we're going to see how he did that. So let's start with Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. If you have your Bible, you could open it there. We're in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7. So verse 17 says this: "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So we know a couple of things from this passage. First thing is that we know that Jesus is not getting rid of the law. He's not getting rid of the Torah. Another word for the law or Old Testament is Torah. So I'll use that interchangeably. So we learn that Jesus is not doing that. Secondly, we learn that, sometimes we tend to think of scribes and Pharisees as these sorts of scoundrels, corrupt and evil in every way. But notice what it says in verse 20. Jesus says to his disciples, your righteousness needs to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. So we all know that the Pharisees do have hypocrisy, but they also have a level of righteousness. And the disciples need to exceed that level. So let's remind ourselves also of what we learned about in the word. We learned a word in the past weeks, and that word was fulfill. Matthew 5:17 that we just read, that verse says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now, oftentimes people have a picture of this word fulfill as checking it off a list. And once it's checked off, then we don't need to deal with it anymore. But when you define fulfill in that way, it starts to sound a lot like abolish, which would make no sense here. Fulfill reflects the Hebrew verb agahin, which means to perform, to uphold, to do. So according to Matthew, Jesus is performing or redoing prophetic history. In Matthew's chapter 1 and 2, we saw that Jesus fulfills the words of the prophets by redoing the history of Israel in himself. So for Jesus to say that I am going to fulfill the Torah, he's saying that I didn't come to abolish it, I came to do it. And to do it rightly, in the way it should be fulfilled. Jesus upholds the Torah. He said in verse 19 of chapter 5 that we just read, whoever does them, the law, and teaches it will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus is not only doing the Torah, but he is protecting it. So how is Jesus protecting the Torah? He does something called building a fence around the Torah. Now there are Jewish writers of Jewish writings of rabbinic Judaism from the 2nd century, which is called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah refers to what Jesus was doing in Matthew as building a fence around the Torah. Now in the Mishnah it says this, be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and build a fence around the Torah. So what does that mean, to build a fence around the Torah? Well, for example, rabbis would say the commandment says don't work on the Sabbath, which comes from Exodus chapter 20. The rabbis would say don't do work on the Sabbath. And then they would say, a good idea would be if you don't want to transgress that or violate that commandment, then don't even pick up your tools. That way you will never do your job-based work on the Sabbath. So what's the commandment? The command is thou shalt not work on the Sabbath. What's the fence here? No tools. So what it's doing is extending a fence that says, if you don't pick up your tools, you'll never break the Sabbath. So that's the fence idea. Now look at what Jesus does in Matthew 5:21 and 22. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Okay, what's the command? The command is thou shalt not murder. What's the fence? Don't get angry at someone. If you never get angry at someone, you won't go as far as to murder them. Now that's good protection of the law. Here's another one. Matthew 5:27 and 28. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." What's the command? The command is, "You shall not commit adultery." What's the fence? Don't look lustfully at a woman. If you don't think about it, you're never going to step over that line and commit actual physical adultery. So Jesus is saying here, don't go there with your mind. And I promise you, you will never commit adultery. That's what's called building a fence around the Torah. Here's another example in Matthew 5:33 to 35. Jesus says, "Again you have heard that it was said, 'Those of old, you shall not swear falsely.'" And that comes from Leviticus 19:12. "But shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king." Now, let me give you some of that cultural historical backdrop right now. To swear falsely means to say that you are going to do something in the name of God and then not do it. It doesn't mean swearing like the kind of swearing that we have today, like curse words, or even saying the word God when you stub your toe. You see, in the ancient world, there was a formula. The ancient Israelites would say, "Hi Adonai," which means, "as the Lord lives." So they would say, "As the Lord lives, I will accomplish X, Y, and Z. And if I don't accomplish X, Y, and Z, may the Lord strike me down. As the living God lives, may I be dead if I don't do this." Now that's swearing falsely and not doing it. And that's bad, to swear falsely. To tell the Lord that you are going to do something and then don't do it. And that's the command in Leviticus. So Jesus says in Matthew, just don't swear at all. Jesus' fence is don't swear at all. Keep your mouth shut, because if you don't swear in the first place, you don't commit that Hi Adonai, as the Lord lives formula to your lips. You'll never break anything that you say. Instead, he says, just let your yes be yes and your no be no. Jesus is very concerned about breaking that command, so much that he sets up a way to not break it. You're sure not to break it if you never swear at all. If you get too familiar with saying, I'm going to do this, 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 and one of these days you're not going to do it. And you're heaping up an obligation on yourself unto God. And if someone neglects a sworn obligation unto God, the sin is doubly great. In other words, don't let your mouth get into the habit of swearing. Now let's look at the golden rule. Matthew 7:12 says, "So in everything do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets." Then he goes on also in Matthew, later on in chapter 22, verse 37 to 40. And you might remember this. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." And he got that from Deuteronomy 6:5. This is the first and greatest command. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And Jesus is getting that latter part from Leviticus 19:18. So do you see how he's piecing together the Torah? He's actually using the Old Testament. He's not coming up with these brand new things. He's actually taking the Old Testament, taking the Torah, and saying, this is how you follow it. This is how you fulfill it. Jesus came to fulfill the law, the Torah. Jesus is protecting the Torah from being broken. And that's what we're reading about in the Sermon on the Mount. So let's move on in the sermon, because Jesus is going to start talking about faith. And so let's look at the word faith for a minute. Faith is a word in the Greek called pistilis. Now that word is best understood as trust. Not in believing in God's existence. I mean, Jesus already, the Jewish people already believe that God exists. See, there is no ancient understanding that God doesn't exist. That wasn't something that they had to jump over. That was just a give me. That was understood. They never didn't think that God didn't exist. But for the Jews, it's not about believing in God's existence, but rather putting one's trust in God to accomplish things. You see, for us, it might be different in our time, where we say to have faith or to trust in God is to have faith in God is to believe that he exists. But you see, the author of this gospel is talking to people that is not an issue for them. The issue is to put one's trust in God to accomplish things. Let me show you what I mean. If we go to Exodus chapter 14:31, Exodus chapter 14:31, and this is what it says. It says, Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord and they trusted. Now that's the past tense form of the word pistis in the Lord and in the servant Moses. As we go further forward, Jesus is going to be talking about faith. And I want to define faith from an Hebraic perspective. So trust and action are two sides of the same coin for Matthew. Now, from Paul's writings in Ephesians 2, many Christians pick up the notion that it's all about faith and trust, and that action and works have nothing to do with it. And so many people get that from Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8. And let me read that verse for you. It's 2, 8, and 9. It says, For it is by grace that you have been saved, through faith, pistis. And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. So there is this split here with faith on one hand and works on the other. But if you actually read 2 verses later, in verse 10, it says this, For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. What's the point here? You see, even Paul doesn't think that there is a split between these two words. See, Matthew makes it super clear that these two words do coexist, and that we receive rewards from the Lord when we put faith and action together. So let's put a text to that. Matthew 6, verses 3 and 4. Now, this is in the Sermon on the Mount. We're still on the mountain. Matthew 6, 3 and 4 says, But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. So giving to the needy is an action. That's works. That's doing something. And notice that Jesus doesn't say, if you give to the needy. He presupposes that you're going to do it. See, we're learning this new equation here in Matthew. Faith plus action equals reward. And this is what we see in this passage, and especially in the book of Matthew. Let's go to Matthew chapter 6, verse 14 and 15. It says, For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins. So forgiveness is doing something for someone, giving up something of yourself and forgiving one another. That's the action. That's the works. And then it says God will reward us by forgiving us. Only if we forgive others. See, there's the action aspect, and there's also the trust aspect that God has the power to forgive us. Faith plus action equals reward. And this is what we're learning. This is what Matthew is highlighting. Here's another one. Matthew 6:6. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Then he goes on in verse 9. This then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Then in verse 11 he says, give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. So we look at that and we see, if we look back at that, we see where it says our Father. Now this passage is also referred to as the Lord's Prayer, but it's also referred to as our Father. Our Father. Our Father's Prayer. We see our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. That's trust. That's the trust aspect. Give us today our daily bread and forgive us our debts. That's trust again. And here comes the action, as we also have forgiven our debtors. Trust, action. Faith, action. Matthew 6:19 and 20 says this. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. So we see here that he's talking about don't put your treasures in earth. But when you store up your treasures in heaven, then it'll be there, it'll be protected, and it won't be destroyed. So you see that faith and action and reward again. And here's another one, Matthew 19:21. Jesus answered, if you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. So you see that. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. There's the action. What's the reward? You will have treasure in heaven. So there's an equation here that Jesus is teaching about the kingdom of heaven through Matthew. And Matthew is highlighting it over and over. So now we come to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And what's interesting is that Jesus ends the Sermon on the Mount like he began it. So he began the Sermon on the Mount, if you remember, in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. And he says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not least stroke of the pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. And then he ends the Sermon on the Mount, these teachings, in chapter 7, verse 21, 22, and 23. Verse 21 says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Now I want to point out something in that word lawlessness. That word, the Greek word, is anomia. Anomia. Now, nomia means law. Means not doing something. For example, we get the word atheist. A theist is someone who believes in theos, God. An atheist is someone who doesn't. Nomia, as you who means as you who don't follow the law, you breakers of the law, nomia. So Matthew is going to go on to say later on in chapter 25, when you do things to people, you are doing them unto me. Prophesying, miracles in your name. And that passage, we did great miracles, we prophesied in your name, we cast out demons in your name. See, that's the faith aspect. But what's missing? The action, the doing part. And Jesus says, because you didn't do the action part, I never knew you. You see, the action part was to obey the Torah. And you who practice not obeying the law are lawlessness. So he's talking about the Torah here because that's what the subject is. You who don't practice the Torah, anomia, I never knew you. And it reminds me of James chapter 2, where James talks about faith without works is dead. What good is it, my brothers, he says, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? And then I think Matthew would tip his hat to James. I think Paul would tip his hat too. And they would all agree. And so we see this equation. We see Jesus unfolding this way of thinking where faith and works are important and that it brings reward from God. And over in the Sermon on the Mount, we see that over and over and over and over as you read through. And he's emphasizing an important part. Not only that, but he's protecting the Torah. And that's the reason why he says, if you even just do this, you're guilty of it. What he's doing is building a wall, a fence around the Torah. And he says to protect the Torah, to protect the law, to protect his word. And so this is what's going on in the Sermon on the Mount. This is what he's trying to communicate to the people that are listening, to his disciples. And so with that, we're going to conclude today. And I pray that these words open a floodgate of fresh understanding of the word. And when you read through Matthew and when you look at these things, I pray that you'll have a new understanding, a fresh understanding, something that enriches not just the words on the page, but may they come to life and understand what Jesus is trying to communicate and what he's trying to not only speak to those disciples that day, but speak to those disciples today. And so I pray that these teachings and these classes will enrich and give a backdrop and a background that you will carry the rest of your life for all the teachings of the Gospels, and especially in Matthew. So with that, God bless you, and until next time, have a great day.